We all have a picture of him in our minds. The man in the corner of the room, hooded and silent, smoke curling from his pipe. Strider, the Ranger of the North. We think of him as a wanderer, a man who has seen the length and breadth of the wild lands. We know the stories, or at least the sketches of them. Decades spent in the lonely wilderness, fighting a secret war against the encroaching shadow. He rode with the Rohirrim. He served in the armies of Gondor under a false name. He journeyed into the far south, into the lands of Harad, where the stars are strange. He was a man defined by motion, by his relentless pursuit of the enemy's servants, wherever they might be found. Aragorn, son of Arathorn, spent nearly 70 years of his long life as a sentinel, a ghost, a guardian moving through the forgotten corners of Middle-earth. But here's the thing nobody talks about. There's a map of his life, a secret map traced by his footsteps across lonely plains and through shadowed mountain passes. And on that map, there is a giant, deliberate blank space. A kingdom he never entered, a forest he walked the borders of, but never the heart. For all his travels, for all his dedication to fighting the growing darkness, Aragorn actively, consistently, and for decades, avoided the one place that was arguably becoming the northern epicenter of Sauron's resurgent evil, the great forest of Mirkwood and the halls of the elven king, Thranduil. It seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? A glaring inconsistency in the legend. Why would the greatest hunter of the enemy's servants refuse to enter a forest practically crawling with them? The easy answers don't hold up. It wasn't too far. It wasn't unimportant. The truth is far more complex, and it reveals more about the crushing weight of his identity than any of his famous battles. What we're about to uncover is not a story of strategy, but a story of fear. A deep, personal and existential fear that defined the man long before he was ever a king. So, have you ever felt the weight of a future you weren't ready for? A name so heavy it felt like it could break you? Because if you have, you are closer to understanding the hidden heart of Aragorn than you might think. We're going to trace the edges of that blank space on his map, and in doing so, we're going to find the real man hiding beneath the ranger's hood. Let's first establish the sheer scale of his journey. It's easy to hear he wandered for decades and let it wash over you as a vague, romantic notion. But the reality is staggering in its scope and endurance. After being told of his heritage by Elrond at the age of 20, Aragorn didn't just step outside the gates of Rivendell and start patrolling the troll shores. He began a period of travel and trial so extensive it's almost hard to comprehend. We know he spent 30 years, from the age of 20 to 49, in the company of the Rangers of the North, learning the hard craft of his people. He learned to read the land, to hunt, to fight in silence, to endure endless hardship. This was his apprenticeship. But then he went further. He went south. For nearly 20 years, he operated under the name Thranduil, the Eagle of the Star. Think about that. He adopted a new identity, a complete persona, and embedded himself in the two greatest remaining kingdoms of men. He rode with King Thengel of Rohan, father of Theoden. He was a trusted advisor, a mighty warrior. The Rohirrim, who value strength and loyalty above all, revered him. He didn't just pass through, he became part of their society, fighting their battles against orcs and Dunlendings. He learned their language, their customs, their sorrows. He was a part of them. Then he travelled even further south to Gondor, serving Ecthelion II, the father of Denethor. There he became a legend. Thranduil was the great captain who seemed to come from nowhere, a man of immense wisdom and foresight, rivaled in the people's esteem only by the steward's own son. He warned Ecthelion of the growing threat from Mordor and the corsairs of Umbar. And he didn't just warn, He acted. In a daring raid, he led a small fleet, sailed into the heart of the enemy's harbour at Umbar, and burned their ships, crippling the corsair threat for a generation. This was an act of incredible bravery, a strategic masterstroke that bought Gondor years of peace on its southern coast. Then, as suddenly as he arrived, he vanished. He left Gondor, sending a message of farewell to the steward, and walked east, alone, into the shadows of Mordor itself. He explored the borders of the land of the enemy. He journeyed into the far south, into the deserts of Harad, and deep into the lands of Rhûn in the east. He was mapping the enemy, learning their strength, their ways, their numbers. He was a spy, an explorer, and a warrior, all in one. He did this for years, alone. This is the man we're talking about. A man who walked into the backyard of the Dark Lord, who fought alongside the Horse Lords, who led the fleets of Gondor, who travelled to the ends of the known world. There was no challenge too great, no distance too far, no enemy too fearsome. His life was a testament to relentless, proactive engagement with the forces of darkness. And that is precisely what makes his avoidance of Mirkwood so profoundly strange. It's not just a place he happened to miss, it's a deliberate, gaping hole in the resume of Middle-earth's most dedicated guardian. Now let's turn our gaze to that dark forest. Mirkwood wasn't just some forgotten backwater. By the time Aragorn was in his prime, it was a festering wound on the face of the world. For 1,000 years, the southern part of the forest had been home to a fortress called Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery. This was the base of operations for the one known as the Necromancer. As we know, this necromancer was no mere hedge wizard. He was Sauron himself, quietly regaining his strength after his defeat in the War of the Last Alliance. The White Council, including Gandalf and Elrond, eventually drove him out, but it was a temporary victory. Sauron fled, but he left the fortress standing, and his influence lingered like a poison in the soil. The darkness in Mirkwood didn't vanish. It simply waited. And by the time of Aragorn's long travels, it was returning with a vengeance. Sauron, now openly declared in Mordor, sent 3 Nazgûl to reoccupy Dol Guldur. The fortress was active again, a northern command centre for the forces of Mordor. From it, a tide of evil flowed out into the forest. The once beautiful Greenwood the Great was now a place of terror and illusion. Its paths were treacherous, its streams were black and enchanted, and it was filled with monstrous creatures, giant spiders. The descendants of Ungoliant spun vast, suffocating webs in the gloom. Orcs from the mountains and from Dol Guldur itself built lairs in the forest's depths, raiding the lands around it. The forest was sick, dying from a sickness of pure evil. And holding the line against this tide were 2 beleaguered groups. In the north, King Thranduil and his Sylvan Elves fought a constant, grinding war. Their kingdom was essentially under siege. They had to perpetually fight to keep the shadows from overwhelming their halls, to keep the forest paths clear enough for passage. And in the west of the forest, along the banks of the Anduin, lived the Woodmen. These were men, brave and hardy, descendants of the same ancient stock as the Dunedain, but without the gift of long life. They lived in fortified homesteads, hunting and farming, under the constant threat of spiders and orcs pouring out of the forest. They were on the front line. Mirkwood was, without question, one of the most active and critical fronts in the Cold War against Sauron. It was a place where the enemy was testing his strength, projecting his power, and threatening the entire Wilderland. It was exactly the kind of place a hero like Aragorn, a man dedicated to protecting the free peoples and fighting the shadow, should have been. He could have brought his immense skill as a warrior and a leader to the aid of the Elves. He could have brought hope and strength to the beleaguered Woodmen, his distant kin. He was needed there, and yet he stayed away, for decades. This wasn't an oversight, it was a choice. And to understand that choice, we have to look past the strategic map and into the heart of the man himself. So why? Let's dismantle the simple explanations first, because they simply don't suffice. Was it a matter of priorities? Was Aragorn's self-appointed task of guarding Eriador and the borders of the Shire simply more important? It was certainly a vital task. The quiet peace of the hobbits was maintained only by the ceaseless, thankless vigilance of the rangers. But Aragorn's travels as Thranduil prove that he saw the fight against Sauron as a global one. He didn't just stay in the north. He went where the threat was greatest, to Rohan, to Gondor, to the very shores of Umbar. The threat in Mirkwood was arguably as great, if not greater, than the Corsair threat he so decisively dealt with. It was a direct outpost of Mordor's power, commanded by the ring-wraiths themselves. To ignore it seems like a strategic blind spot, something Aragorn simply did not have. Was it because the Elves didn't need or want his help? Thranduil was famously proud, and his people were wary of outsiders. It's possible he would have been turned away, but Aragorn was raised in Rivendell. He spoke Elvish fluently. He was the foster son of Elrond, one of the most respected figures in all of Middle-earth. He knew how to navigate the complex world of elven culture. He was welcomed in Lothlorien by Galadriel herself, a realm even more secretive and hidden than Thranduil's. The idea that he would be summarily dismissed by Thranduil without even trying doesn't ring true. The Elves of Mirkwood were fighting a desperate war. They would not have turned away a warrior of his caliber, especially one with his credentials. So if it wasn't strategy, and it wasn't elven politics, what was it? The answer lies not with the king of the woodland realm, but with what that king remembered. We have to go back 3,000 years, to the slopes of Mount Doom and the end of the Second Age. Thranduil is ancient. He is not as old as Galadriel or Elrond, but he is old enough to have been there. He fought in the War of the Last Alliance. He was there on the battlefield of Dagorlad. He saw the terrible siege of Barad-dûr. His father, Orifer, was killed in that war, slain in a reckless charge against the gates of Mordor. Thranduil survived. He saw the fall of Sauron. And more importantly, he saw what happened next. He saw Isildur, the son of the slain High King Elendil, cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand. And he was there in the council afterwards, with Elrond and Círdan, when they begged Isildur to destroy the ring in the fires of the mountain. He saw Isildur refuse. He saw the ring's corruption take hold in an instant. Thranduil looked upon the face of Isildur, a face filled with pride and the shadow of the ring, and he never forgot it. Now, fast forward 3,000 years. Aragorn is the heir of Isildur, and while he is separated from his ancestor by 60 generations of men, he is not just any man. The blood of Númenor runs true and strong in him, and with it, the blood of the Eldar from Luthien Tinuviel. He has the grace and the keen sight of the Elves, and the stature and gravitas of the ancient kings of men. Elrond himself noted that in Aragorn, the likeness of the ancient elven friends was reborn. He would have looked familiar, not a perfect copy, of course, but the cast of his face, the light in his eyes, the nobility of his bearing, all of it would have echoed with the memory of his ancestors, especially to an elf whose memory is long and painfully clear. Aragorn's entire mission, the plan laid out for him by Elrond and Gandalf, depended on secrecy. He was to be tested in the wild, to grow into his strength and wisdom without the world knowing who he was. If Sauron had learned that the heir of Isildur still lived, that the blade that cut the ring from his hand had been reforged, he would have bent all his power to finding and destroying him. Aragorn's anonymity was his greatest shield, and Thranduil's court was perhaps the one place in the world where that shield was most likely to be broken. Everywhere else, Aragorn could be Strider, Thranduil, a nameless wanderer from the north. His nobility might be apparent, but his specific lineage was hidden. But in the halls of the Elven King, he would be face to face with one of the last living beings who had looked upon Isildur in his pride and his fall. Thranduil would not need to be told. He would simply know. He would see the ghost of the past walking in his halls. And Thranduil, for all his nobility, was not known for his subtlety or his alignment with the plans of Gandalf and Elrond. He was isolationist, proud, and deeply mistrustful, especially of anything related to the follies of men that had cost his people so dearly. The risk of recognition and the catastrophic consequences that would follow was simply too great. Aragorn stayed away from Mirkwood not because he didn't care about the darkness there, but because he was terrified of the light that would be shone on him. He was hiding from the one man who could look at his face and see not a ranger, but a king and a curse. Let's imagine that moment. Let's construct the scene that Aragorn must have played over in his mind 1,000 times, the scene that kept him on the borders of that sickened forest. Picture him, decades younger, perhaps in his 50s or 60s, still a young man by the reckoning of his people. He's heard the tales of the growing darkness, of the spiders and the orcs. His conscience gnaws at him. He feels the pull of duty. So he goes. He travels north along the Anduin, crosses the old forest road, and makes his way through the shadowed eaves to the enchanted river that guards the entrance to Thranduil's kingdom. He is brought, hooded and cloaked as is his custom, into the great cavernous halls. The air is cool and filled with the faint scent of stone and forest wine. Elven guards, silent and graceful with spears of ash wood, lead him before the throne. And on that throne, carved from living rock and woven with living branches, sits the king. Thranduil. His silver-gold hair is crowned with leaves of autumn, and his eyes are like starlight seen through ice. He is ancient, beautiful, and hard. The guards announce the visitor, a Dunedain of the north, a ranger come to offer his sword. Thranduil gestures for him to lower his hood, and Aragorn, bound by the courtesy of a king's hall, complies. The firelight flickers across his face, the grey eyes, the dark hair flecked with grey even then, the lines of care and weariness etched around his mouth. For a long moment, Thranduil is silent. His gaze is no longer just curious. It is piercing, analytical. He is searching through the vast library of his memory, 3 millennia deep. He sees the high cheekbones, the stern jaw, the look of a man born to command. He sees something of Elendil the Tall, a figure of distant legend. But then he sees something more. He sees the pride, the strength, but also the shadow of a great burden. He sees Isildur. It's not a perfect match, but a family resemblance that echoes across ages. The recognition dawns in his ancient eyes. He leans forward on his throne. "I have seen your face before," he might say, his voice a soft rustle of leaves. "On the fields of Dagorlad, in the shadow of the Mountain of Fire." The words would hang in the air, a death sentence for Aragorn's hidden life. In that instant, everything would change. He would no longer be Strider. The news would spread like wildfire. The elves would know. Soon, the spies of the enemy would know. The hunt would begin. The quiet, lonely war he had been fighting would be over, replaced by a desperate flight from Sauron's full attention. The hope of Arnor, the secret plan of the wise, would be extinguished in a moment of recognition. This is the scene he feared. This is the risk he could not take. And so he turned away from Mirkwood, again and again, choosing the safety of anonymity over the call of a battle he desperately wanted to fight. But this decision comes with a cost, a deep and unspoken moral weight. Because the elves were not the only ones fighting in that forest. As we mentioned, there were the Woodmen. These people are a footnote in the great histories, an overlooked and forgotten tribe. But they were Aragorn's people. The Beornings and the Woodmen of western Mirkwood were the last remnants of the Northmen, the people from whom the Rohirrim had come. And going further back, their ancestors were related to the three houses of the Edain, the very men who had been the friends of the Elves in the First Age, and from whom the Númenóreans, and thus Aragorn himself, were descended. They were his kin, distant, humble, and forgotten, but his kin nonetheless. They were living hard lives under the shadow of Dol Guldur, holding their small patches of land through sheer grit and courage. They were being picked off by spiders, their villages raided by orcs. They were fighting and dying in the dark, without glory, without song, without hope of a great victory. They were just trying to survive. Aragorn, as the last chieftain of the Dúnedain and the rightful High King, had a duty to all the scattered remnants of the faithful men of the West. He had a duty to them. He was the king they didn't know they had. His presence among them could have changed everything. A warrior of his skill, a leader of his charisma and wisdom, could have helped them organize, fortified their defenses, led them in raids against the enemy. He could have been a beacon of hope in their darkening world. He could have saved lives, but to help them, he would have had to operate on the very borders of Thranduil's kingdom, in the shadow of the Elven King's influence. The risk of being seen, of being reported, of a chance encounter with an Elven patrol, was too high. And so he made a choice, a terrible, necessary, utilitarian choice. He sacrificed the few to protect his potential to one day save the many. He chose to let his own people suffer and die in the dark so that the secret of his identity, the great hope for the future, could remain safe. This is the hidden tragedy of Strider the Ranger. We see him as a flawless hero, but his long years in the wild were filled with these kinds of impossible calculations. Every path he took was also a path he didn't take. Every group he saved meant another was left to fend for itself. His avoidance of Mirkwood wasn't just about protecting himself. It was about abandoning a part of his own charge. It was a wound in his conscience that must have ached for decades. Obisi, this is the core of Aragorn's burden, the central conflict that defined his entire life before the Fellowship. He lived in a state of constant, agonizing tension between two contradictory duties. On one hand, he had his immediate duty as the chieftain of the Dúnedain, to protect the scattered peoples of the north, to guard the borders of the Shire, to keep the memory of Arnor alive, and to fight the servants of the enemy wherever he found them. This duty required him to be Strider, anonymous, mobile, pragmatic, and ruthless, a ghost in the wilderness. On the other hand, he had his ultimate duty, to one day claim the throne of Gondor and Arnor, to reunite the sundered kingdoms, and to lead all the free peoples in the final war against Sauron. This duty required him to be Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir of Isildur, Elisar the Elfstone, a symbol, a legend, a king. For 70 years, these two duties were in direct opposition. To be an effective Strider, he had to suppress Aragorn. To reveal Aragorn would be to destroy Strider and his mission. Every decision he made was a balancing act on this razor's edge. His journey as Thorongil was a perfect example. He could be a great captain in Gondor and Rohan precisely because no one knew who he really was. They saw his innate nobility, but they attributed it to some lost line of lords, not the single most important lineage in the world. He was effective because he was a mystery. Mirkwood presented a unique problem. It was the one place where his identity would be the first and most important thing about him. In Gondor, his actions defined him. In Rohan, his sword arm defined him. In the wild, his skill as a tracker defined him. But in Thranduil's court, his face, his blood, his name would define him. It was the one place he couldn't hide behind a pseudonym or a cloak. It was the one place where the past was not the past, where 3,000 years was a recent memory. So he made the cold calculation of a king in waiting. He weighed the lives of the Woodmen and the strategic value of aiding the Elves against the catastrophic risk of premature revelation. And with a heavy heart, he chose the long game. He chose to preserve the hope of the king over the immediate needs of a few subjects. It's a brutal choice, the kind of choice that leaders are forced to make, the kind that separates heroes of song from the real, weary figures who have to live with the consequences. He walked away from Mirkwood because the man who would have entered, Strider, would have been destroyed, and the man who would have been revealed, Aragorn, was not yet ready to face the world. And this brings us to the deepest layer of the truth. His avoidance of Mirkwood wasn't just about Thranduil's memory or strategic calculation. It was about his own fear. Not the fear of being killed, but the fear of becoming who he was meant to be. The weight of his destiny was immense. He was the heir to a broken line, a failed kingdom, and a terrible mistake. The blood of Isildur, who claimed the ring, flowed in his veins. The weight of that failure, the fear that he too might fail when tested, was his constant companion. He was raised with the knowledge that the fate of the world might one day rest on his shoulders. That is a terrifying burden for anyone to carry. His long years as Strider were, in a way, a postponement of that destiny. In the wild, he had a clear, definable mission. Hunt orcs, guard the roads, keep the darkness at bay. It was hard, thankless work, but it was simple. It had rules. But the role of king was something else entirely. It was a role of symbols, of politics, of uniting disparate and mistrustful peoples. It meant facing not just orcs, but the doubts of men like Denethor, the pride of lords, the ancient grief of the elves. It meant becoming the hope of the world. And a part of him, the human part, was terrified of it. Mirkwood was the place that would force the issue. To be recognized by Thranduil would be to have his destiny thrust upon him, ready or not. It would mean the end of his life as Strider and the beginning of his life as Aragorn the king. And for decades he was not ready to let Strider go. Strider was a shield. Strider was a way to do good in the world without having to carry the full, crushing weight of the crown. And this is where his story pivots from a high fantasy epic to a deeply universal human truth. How many of us have avoided the one place, the one conversation, the one opportunity that would force us to become the person we are meant to be, or are afraid we are meant to be? We stay in the comfortable role of potential because the reality of fulfillment is terrifying. It comes with responsibility, with the risk of failure, with the end of all other possibilities. Aragorn avoiding Mirkwood is the brilliant student afraid to publish their work. It's the talented artist afraid to have their first show. It's any of us, standing on the edge of a great life change, hesitating. We prefer the wilderness of our preparations to the stark throne room of our actual purpose. Aragorn's fear wasn't cowardice. It was a profoundly human response to an inhuman burden. He stayed away from the forest because it was a mirror, and in it he would have to face the king staring back. But destinies, once set in motion, cannot be avoided forever. They can only be postponed. And in the end, Aragorn's story finds its resolution not in avoidance, but in embrace. The beautiful, quiet irony is that when the time finally came for him to accept his role, the first person from that feared kingdom to join him was not the king, but the king's son. At the Council of Elrond, Legolas Greenleaf, son of Thranduil, arrives. He comes as a messenger, bringing news of Gollum's escape from their custody, an escape that happened, poetically, in Mirkwood. And there, in the one safe place where Aragorn is finally revealed to the world, the son of the king he avoided pledges himself to his cause. The breach is healed. The kingdom he held at arm's length for a lifetime sends its prince to stand by his side. Their friendship becomes one of the cornerstones of the fellowship, a perfect union of man and elf, a symbol of the renewed alliance that will be needed to defeat Sauron. The debt that Aragorn felt he owed to Mirkwood, the aid he could never give, is repaid 100-fold by the loyalty and skill of Legolas. It's a quiet act of grace, a mending of a wound Aragorn had carried for over 60 years. When he finally steps onto the path of kingship, the path leads him directly through a friendship with the one person who represents everything he once had to fear. He could not go to the father, so fate sent him the son. And when we circle back to that first image of him in the prancing pony, we see him differently. The weariness in his eyes is not just from lack of sleep or the hard miles of the road. It is the weariness of a man who has spent a lifetime making impossible choices, of carrying the secret of a king inside the rags of a ranger. He is quiet not just because he is watchful, but because he is burdened by the knowledge of the places he has been and the places he has been forced to abandon. His strength is not just the strength of a warrior, but the strength of someone who has stared into the abyss of his own destiny and chosen, time and again, to keep walking the lonely path of preparation. He was not a perfect hero on a grand adventure. He was a man haunted by his past and terrified of his future, who did his duty anyway. He made the hard choice to sacrifice a part of his charge, to live with that moral compromise in service of a greater hope. And in the end, he learned that the only way to bear the weight of the crown is to finally, bravely, allow yourself to wear it. The blank space on the map of his life wasn't a failure. It was the price of victory. It was the long, quiet, and necessary shadow that his own light would one day have to cast.